Welcome, thanks for coming. Just wanted to offer our panelists an opportunity briefly to introduce themselves, but by way of framing, I want to talk a little bit about why these students are here. So all three of these students, as they've been working on their own research this year, have looked at issues that are pertinent to risk in defense strategy. Risk is a kind of nebulous concept, and when you think about risk that we're taking with defense strategy, I think part of the confusion and in some cases the lack of a productive dialogue about risk stems from the ways in which people use risk to describe several different aspects of defense strategy. So you can think about risk from a purely budgetary standpoint. Are we taking risk in so far as we're spending less as a percentage of GDP? Is it that we're spending less in inflation-adjusted dollars, so the absolute number that matters? Is it that we have some competitors, potentially, who are trailing us but catching up? So it's a relative discussion. So just in looking at the budget alone, the risk management perspective is clouded. Some people will actually use the same numbers to tell different stories. They'll say, by historical standards, we're spending a large amount in absolute terms. By historical standards, we're spending a small amount in budget to GDP ratio. So you have budget as an indicator of risk. But that's not all. I mean, we could talk about risk management from the perspective of force structure. So each of the services has its own vocabulary by which it kind of gauges how much it has relative to its sense of mission requirements. The Navy thinks about total ships, aircraft carriers or carrier strike groups at sea. The Army talks about end strength and BCTs. The Air Force is fighter wings. So you can now have a discussion that's purely focused on force structure. How much do we have in place? Okay, well, you've got the structure, you've got the budget. What missions are you preparing for? That's a third area of the risk discussion. So how ready are we for the missions that we think we're going to be required to do? That can deal purely with a view of like not being ready for homeland defense. It's a little cloudier now because I think the military itself is sort of struggling through articulating the core mission set in some respects. But it used to be the two major combat operations as a sort of framework for gauging readiness. Readiness is, again, one perspective on risk. What about modernization? How are we doing in terms of our technological progress? We're, in the Air Force, Derek's going to talk about this a bit, but the Air Force flies a lot of airframes that are quite old, and so they see themselves as taking a lot of technological risk, and the F-35, I think, is a program that's supposed to mitigate that risk. Finally, you can think about latent power. Like, what's the risk that we have in terms of just the latent power of the United States? And by that I mean the economy, the industrial base, the human capital of the United States. So in US history, we entered wars without necessarily being ready for them. We didn't, at the entry of the United States into the Second World War, we didn't have all of the force structure, all of the systems, all the things that we wanted to fight the war, but we had a lot of latent power that we could then bring into the fight. Is that still true? To what extent is that true? Can we continue to rely on that? So, when you hear congressional representatives from sort of different delegations arguing that a program needs to be continued in order to support a firm that's building X platform, that's an argument for risk management in that latent power space. So risk is a big concept. And we're going to touch on several aspects of that in this discussion. I think if there's a theme, it's the idea that when you want to manage risk well, the most important factor is knowing where you're taking risk. The one thing you do not want to do is take risk without knowing it. It's actually okay to be explicit in taking risk, but what we want to avoid is essentially what characterized the financial crisis, and that is a situation in which you don't know the risks that you're taking. So without further ado, I'd like to give my colleagues here a chance to introduce themselves, and if they choose, they can offer some initial high-level comments, and then we'll get into some questions. And we'd like to open it up to the floor. It's at one point in the discussion, so you can ask questions as well. Derek?
Good afternoon. Derek O'Malley, obviously the token Air Force guy, probably in the room. Know that we have some retired Air Force folks here, I know. My background, I grew up as an F-16 pilot in the Air Force, graduated from our Air Force Weapons School, and then was there as an instructor for several years. As I got a little older, I took command of an operational test squadron where I had the opportunity to transition to the F-35, so I was intimately involved very recently in standing up the F-35 program for the Air Force. So from my perspective, you know, both of these guys have written their SRPs on risk. I have not. This hasn't really been my focus of study. But I come at it specifically from the acquisition standpoint in looking at our acquisition strategies, particularly the F-35. And I'll hold the specific of this comment for later. But my interest in this is that as we continually invest in high-end platforms, there's this sense that we are automatically reducing risk. You know, you buy an expensive toy, risk is reduced. From my perspective, in many cases, that's actually the opposite of what happens. And that's certainly been my experience with the F-35. So with that introduction, I'll save the rest of that for later. Here you go.
Thanks, Derek. My name's Chuck Rush, an infantry officer by trade. Commanded a battalion, done most of the traditional assignments an infantry officer would be expected to do. But I've also spent a couple of tours in the ORSA community at our analytical agencies within the Army, and as well as an opportunity to serve at the State Department from 2008 to 2009 on the Afghanistan desk while we were being a part of the process that led to the surge decision in Afghanistan and you know, kind of the strategy that moved forward from the President's speech at West Point from 2009. So the focus of my SRP was really to go back and look at the foundation of how we view strategic risk. And sort of a view that the way the Army looks at it from a doctrinal perspective is insufficient. You know, we tend to define it as the probability and severity of a loss linked to hazard. That's the doctrinal definition. But at the level of strategy, is that really a definition that is sufficient when we're talking ends, ways, and means in very unique settings? If you look at this idea of probability of loss, that assumes that there's sort of a historical or an empirical basis of experience that then we can look at a situation and judge risk based on a particular situation. Whereas at the level of strategy, and you look at the problem sets from a national security perspective that our country is facing, many of these are very unique. So there may be similar situations in our historical experience with respect to a problem set, but they're not the same. And so this idea that we can extrapolate from history and come up with some of these models for risks that we look at may be, you know, something that we need to relook. So the focus of my research was really to try to define from a national security perspective what strategic risk is, and then maybe a framework to better assess it that is not linked to, really in my view, an actuarial kind of model of, you know, probability and severity of loss. I think that fits for our view of accidental risk in terms of how we view, you know, we do military operations and, you know, sort of this accidental view, but does that model necessarily translate to the level in the practice of strategy? And I don't believe it does. So that was really the extent of my focus, and really this idea that, you know, this idea of uncertainty, volatility. You know, we talk about the VUCA environment here at the War College. That puts risk in a much different light than this certainty that analysts can view all these separate risks and come up with a model that can give us sort of a precise valuation, low, medium, high, extremely high, something of that nature. And that's a useful language when we're talking with political decision makers. So with that, turn over to Cliff.
Hi, Cliff Trout. I came here from the Chairman's Action Group down with General Dempsey, and before that worked at the National Security Council on the Afghan-Pakistan account. My research this year is really not merely looking at risk, but looking at how it affects our strategy development, whether that's a defense strategy in the broad contours of what we're wrestling with now to become more sustainable, or even the implications on smaller strategies as we were looking at the way ahead in Afghanistan and Pakistan, and the implication of risk, more specifically, risk being adverse to risk or ability to accept risk. And as I've looked at this, I've kind of recognized some of the legacy that we see from the Cold War that still has an effect on the way that we develop strategy. And I think as we look at a third offsetting strategy, and I think what's going to be largely discussed here this week is finding that sustainable defense strategy. There are some issues that we're going to have to look at within risk and how we view risk, how we manage risk, and more importantly, the measures that we need to take to make sure that we are, in fact, reducing risk and in a sustainable way. And so that's really what I've looked at. I've looked at a couple of the strategies defense strategies that we've tried to implement previously that have implications to risk that in ways that people may not necessarily see. So it will be interesting. I appreciate the opportunity to come here and be able to discuss what we've been working on this year. So I look forward to the discussion.
Thanks. Now, I know we're going to come back to this idea of definitions of risk. Chuck, you just kind of talked about how, in many respects, the common definition that's used doctrinally in the Army may not be the most helpful. But for this next question, I'm just going to offer a kind of working definition. We'll come back to it. So let's say view risk as the potential for an outcome that is adverse to your objectives. So an outcome that's against what you hope for. How do you characterize risk right now in the current strategic environment? I mean, just broad strokes. Where do you see there's risk? Derek, you want to start?
Sure. I'll rephrase the definition a little bit just because I have Admiral Winnefeld's definition in my mind, which is the same thing. He said the difference between the risk is the difference between the threats to a national security interest and our ability to protect it. Since I've kind of framed my thoughts in that light. So as we look at our ability to mitigate risk, there are kind of two components broadly. First, what can we do about it? And obviously our adversaries get a vote as well. And we have to think of both. And I think commonly, at least from my perspective in the Air Force, as we talk about risk, we fixate on what the adversary is going to do. And we tend to kind of sideline how our own decisions and our own actions can also increase risk. But that's kind of been my focus as I've looked into this topic a little bit more. Let me give you an example, kind of a concrete example in my mind where our actions created a risk that we never saw until it was obviously very clear and lives were lost. So this is OIF 2003. I'm at this time an F-16 CJ pilot in a Wild Weasel squadron. So our job was suppression of enemy air defenses. So our job is to get out there, find the surface-to-air missile systems that can target other aircraft, take them out with our high-speed anti-radiation missiles so that they're not there to give any problems to the strikers that are more vulnerable. So on this particular night, I was escorting a strike package of F-14s into some targets in Baghdad. And just as we were on the southern edge of Baghdad, I saw a series of missile launches off my left wing. We're all flying at night, so it's very easy to see missile launches. It's also very difficult on night vision goggles to perceive, what's close to you, what's not. I know many of you are well aware of that. So what you do initially when you see a missile launch is you threat react until you can determine who's being targeted. Fortunately, in that case, nobody in our strike package had been targeted. Just a few moments later, we were notified that an F-18 had been shot down west of our position. So I correlated that was very likely what we had witnessed off our left wing. So for the next 12 hours, we did the combat search and rescue for this downed F-18 pilot. After I landed that night, it was a 12-hour sortie. Found out that the pilot had been killed, unfortunately. But even worse, we found out that it wasn't an Iraqi SA-6, as we had thought, that had taken down that pilot. It was unfortunately a U.S. Army Patriot battery that had shot down Nathan White that night. And for us, as an F-16 CJ pilot, a Wild Weasel, and I could tell you everything about the Iraqi air defenses. I knew where all the SAMs were, at least the ones that weren't mobile. I knew how to defeat that integrated air defense system. But never did I think that the threat would be from the Patriots. And as unfortunately we saw throughout that conflict, it was a significant problem for us. Now, what did we miss? Obviously, the great men and women that operated Patriot batteries, it wasn't. I don't blame them. The problem was the interoperability was not something we had ever focused on. We never realized the risk in not really exercising that, really developing the technology to make sure that the interrogators on the Patriot could properly talk to our aircraft. So to me, it's just a very concrete example, one that I will never forget, of the risks of what happens when you don't see the risks in your own behavior. Obviously, we've taken great steps since then to fix it. So as a general theme to the comments that I'll make later as we proceed here, I think that not only will the risks we see in the future be from our adversaries, we know that, but I think perhaps in an increasing proportion, our own actions are going to be the culprit for increasing risk in our operations.
So, two thoughts on this question. First, you hear a lot about, and both versions of the president's national security strategy have articulated this idea of one of our strategic interests is the maintenance of the international order. And so, if you look at risk from that lens, do you perceive every threat to the international order as a risk then that must be mitigated? And if you believe that, we start to find ourselves being engaged in a lot of different ways, in a lot of different fashions that over time become costly and unsustainable. And I think where you see this manifest is in our counterterrorism strategy. There's a lot of talk now about trying to develop a sustainable CT, is a term that you'll hear now with Special Operations Command, trying to find a way to target terrorist networks globally, but in a sustainable fashion. So if you look at this idea then of risk and, okay, what are we willing to accept with respect to terrorist attacks? There's a great anecdote in Woodward's book on Obama Wars talking about Al-Qaeda and the emergence of AQAP and these other groups that have the intention and in some cases capability to be able to target within the borders of the United States. And this idea then that protecting the homeland being the number one strategic objective that the Defense Department talks about, do we have the ability to realistically prevent every terrorist attack from coming onto our soil? Or are we resilient enough as a nation where we could even take another 9/11 type attack on our soil and still survive? Is it really an existential threat or not that requires this vast capability and network of intelligence and strike packages and this global reach of our CT forces that does it really take that? Or do we look at the CT threat in a different way? And this is one of the discussions that Woodward relates, talking about President Obama's view about it, where he talks about our country probably can take another 9/11. Now, is it desirable? Absolutely not, and that's not what I'm advocating. But the nexus of a terrorist organization with the capabilities and means to bring, say, a weapon of mass destruction within the borders of the United States, does that strategy then, if we look at the threat from something that is a bit more existential, like the use of a WMD device within the borders of the United States, does that then create a different architecture for our counterterrorism forces that maybe can allow it to more focus and more sharpen on those groups that have a legitimate capability to do us great harm as opposed to do us harm? And so I think that's one of the views that I'm seeing is that we're almost regarding all these groups from the terrorism side as a threat and a risk, and therefore, anytime you see an Islamic terrorist group that proclaims some allegiance to Al-Qaeda or Islamic State, they get a designation, then we do threat finance, and then all these tools that we have developed to target these guys. Is that a sustainable strategy moving forward? And I think depending on how you view risk, it may or may not be. But at least from the military side, there's a recognition that what we are doing now is simply not a sustainable way moving forward. And so how we view risk, do we accept the risk that from time to time there might be a terrorist attack within our soil versus a truly catastrophic attack, say with an organization that has access to WMD? Those are two different components of risk that you could then maybe design a more realistic strategy about how to deal with these groups. Because I don't think the phenomenon is going to go away, but certainly how you view the level of acceptance of risk with the terrorist attack, I think greatly matters in terms of how we look at our strategy.
It's interesting. I've found over the course of my research that terms really matter here. Definitions really matter. For folks in the military, as you've heard my classmates say up here, described risk differently. And when you turn on or tune in a congressional posture hearing, you hear the combatant commanders discussing risk and what happens if they are not resourced to this level, or you hear the chairman describe risk in a way that reinforces or justifies our resource allocation. And so I want to go back to a second to what Derek said, because I think it's important, because being able to determine what that risk is and be able to clearly articulate it, we have to start with that definition. And I think it's a useful starting point to go back to Admiral Winnefeld's definition of that gap between our security interests and our ability to protect them. And I think if we say this another way in strategic terms of, hey, we have a misalignment of our ends, ways, and means, and you could argue that since 9/11, our ends, our strategic ends, have seemed to be expansive, as Chuck mentioned through the national security strategy, the two that President Obama has published. We see that expansion of ends. We're not so much seeing the expansion that's commensurate with that to our ways and means. Now, this isn't to say that we need to reverse the defense cuts, but it is to say, let's look at the risk that we're countering. Because right now, as you hear the debates rage on about defense budgets and cuts and what we're looking at, the risk that we're articulating to you as a military, to the civilian, or to the American people, is the high-end threats, the threats from China, the threats from Russia. And the reason we do that, obviously, is because those high-end platforms are able to garner some of those resources that we're looking at. What you have to ask yourself then is, whilst we're focused on these high-end threats, are we making ourselves, are we accepting more risk on the lower end of that for long-term, the more probable type of threats that we face? And so as we look at this and we look at developing the next strategy, we've really got to view that through the lens of risk and how we view that risk. So the definition there and the misalignment of ends, ways, and means, and those gaps of our ability to protect that is really important definition to hang on to.
Let me ask a follow-up, Cliff, to
Yeah.
that, which is you described how, by focusing on traditional state-based threats, we may be missing a more probable and persistent risk and taking risk where we don't want to. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, thanks. So since World War II, the United States has reviewed defense strategy and changed the strategic direction of the military to better address the evolving security environment with reduced budgets. Now, Andrew loves it when I say this, because he's like, oh, that's so obvious. We all know that the security environment is becoming more complex. We know that we're dealing with reduced budgets. What we don't focus on, though, so much is that we've done that before. There's a reason why Deputy Secretary Work is going to come here this week and discuss the third offset strategy. And we don't really focus on those first two. At the end of World War II, the end of Korea, you see the New Look strategy, which traded off ground forces for reliance on strategic weapons. Now, whether or not that was effective, whether or not that work can be argued, and we can have those discussions in the Q&A. But the reality is, and the thing that we need to take away from the New Look, is that it was an explicit acceptance of risk. President Eisenhower basically said, we are going to lower our conventional forces in Europe and offset that with investments into the strategic weapons. And that's how we countered that threat. And then again, at the end of Vietnam, Secretary Brown with the offsetting strategy that really took not only the offset of how to use technology and leverage that against this numerically superior force that the Soviets possessed, but to also find a high-low mix so that we can counter some of these lower-end threats. And that's important. Now, as we look at this, I think that that's where the Defense Department's trying to go with this third offsetting strategy. And not just a focus on the high-end threats that we see in these exquisite hedges. I mean, we look at Derek's airplane. It's phenomenal. The F-35 is a great platform on the high end. We look at some of these other acquisition programs like the Zumwalt or for the Navy, where we're trading our capacity with capability, meaning that we're going to go with exquisite hedges that are extremely capable platforms, but fewer of them instead of a number of lower end platforms that give us capacity. As we're looking at this third offset, it has to be more than just the moniker of that offset. We have to do more than just the budget cuts and still moving towards those high-end threats. Because getting to Andrew's point of, as we focus on these exquisite hedges, as we focus on countering these high-end threats from nation states, are we still going to be experiencing these threats from a low signature, low-end threat that we see around the globe today? And that's really where we have to make sure that we're also focused on those threats as well.
Sure.
And if you look at, I look at, the infantry forces over time, and sort of how we've offset manpower for technological capability and lethality. Are we reaching a point where the advances are we going to make appreciable gains in technological capability to offset having a manpower capability that does create a quality all its own? And if you look at a speech that General Perkins gave just a few days ago down in Huntsville, one of the things he talked about was how expensive our high-end capability to defeat a low-end threat can be. And he used the example of a truck, say a Toyota truck that ISIL is using in and around Mosul with a machine gun mounted on the back, and yet our means to defeat that is a missile or a JDAM or something coming off of a F-16 or some other type of platform to defeat a very low-cost capability. And is that moving forward sustainable? You look at the IED phenomenon that we've experienced the last, say, 14 or 15 years now. If you were to look at the relative costs of what the Taliban and the Iranians and other groups who proliferated IEDs throughout the battlefield relative to the billions of dollars that we expended, and not just the material capabilities such as MRAP and MATV, but the intelligence architecture and the entire focus that we had on defeating a relatively low-cost threat, the IED, is that something in the long term that we as a military can afford to do or not? And I think that's an important thing that we need to think about, that our risk aversion to casualties, which is where I think some of this comes from, may work against us when we try to design these exquisite weapon systems that have the technological capability to manage and mitigate risk of large-scale casualties, but at the same time, is that a sustainable strategy going forward that we can afford as a military and as a nation?
Derek?
Really commenting on what you both have said there, I think the Air Force, and I know that all the services have this tendency, we tend to rely on trickle-down strategies in that we purchase a high-end platform like an F-35 that can supposedly do well in a high-end threat, high-end mission, and then expect it also to be able to perform low-end missions. You just naturally assume that it'll be able to handle that. I think a metaphor for that would be the equivalent of buying a Ferrari for a high-speed chase and then also using it to go pick up groceries. Now, it may be able to pick up groceries just fine, but it's not a very efficient way of doing it. Probably doesn't have the storage space that, say, a minivan might have that might be a lot cheaper. So, is it catastrophic when you buy a Ferrari and use it for both of those roles? I'd say no, it's not catastrophic, it's inefficient. But what if you buy a Ferrari that is now not capable of picking up groceries? And that, to me, I think is the biggest problem. You look at an F-35, right now we're banking on that thing to be able to do everything. And if it does well on the high end, but we're vulnerable here in the low end, which is what Cliff's alluding to, that's a big problem. It's something I think we need to look very closely at.
So you guys have all described this, maybe broad, and this is going to be a broad generalization, but this approach that through modernization, you have overmatch across this full spectrum of capabilities, and that allows you to not need as much as an adversary, right? Derek, maybe to start, I mean, you talked about how we may be assuming risk just now in this example of, well, okay, what happens if there's something it cannot do? I mean, do you see that happening now? I mean, or is that just a hypothetical risk that you're describing?
I think it's hypothetical, and I feel better. Most of us listened to General Welsh last week. I think we have senior leaders that actually do understand that you can't afford just to buy an entirely fifth-generation solution. You can't just buy F-35s and F-22s and go, that's all we need. However, you look at the numbers that the Air Force is talking about buying in the F-35. 1763 is the number. And I think there's a lot of political rhetoric and theater that goes into that. I honestly don't think the Air Force necessarily intends to buy that many. We'll see. But the point is, you can't afford to buy it. And if you did buy just that, you would not have any resources left over to invest in the low end. I think General Welsh said this very well. I don't know if he said it to the big crowd, but certainly as he was talking to the Air Force folks, we have to have a high-low strategy. You have to be able, you can't rely on the high end just to do both. You have to have a mixture, and the only way you do that is by buying fewer Ferraris and so you can invest in minivans as well. Finding that balance is obviously easier said than done, but I do think, Andrew, it is hypothetical. I don't feel like we're on this, death spiral that we can't avert.
And I know you've written some about sort of using this idea of disruption, right? And the discussion of the high-low mix is potentially a mitigation to the potential for disruption. I don't know if you can talk.
Yeah, okay, I'll go into that right now. So disruption, you want to give the academics on disruption first before I do? I'm sure you'll do it better than I will. Okay.
Just the moderator.
So disruption, this is a piece of my SRP. Probably most folks in here are familiar with it, but general concept is you have some existing technology. So in this case, let's say we have a big furniture radio like the ones that were used, the analog radios that were in living rooms throughout America for many years. High quality, everybody has them. Then transistor technology emerges. They're small, they're portable, but the sound quality is not very good. They're foreign made. So naturally, the companies that build these big furniture radios, they neglect this technology. They say it's cheap. Why would our customers want this cheap knockoff when they can have high quality American-made products? Well, gradually, the transistor technology improves. The sound quality gets better. People love the portability, and soon enough, it completely displaces the big furniture radios. Those disappear, and now the analog transistor technology takes over. It's disrupted the existing technology. So let me take that into defense kind of example. The F-22. So if you look back in the way we conducted aerial warfare prior to Vietnam, through Vietnam, you pretty much had to point at an adversary if you wanted to kill him. And this is kind of in the visual arena that we're talking about. So in other words, this is me shooting. I got to be pointing at that guy to kill him. I can be at various aspects, but my best place to be, I'm really excited I can talk with my hands on this panel. The best place for me to be would be somewhere back here in what we would call a control zone. I'm stabilized, I can take the shot. My missile doesn't have to do as much work to get there. Likewise, if I'm employing bullets, this is a good place to be. I'm stabilized, whereas if I'm higher aspect, that's a more fleeting shot. So because of that, for me to maneuver my aircraft to this position, that takes actually a fair amount of skill. You can imagine as I start out and emerge like this, and this dogfight continues, it's going to take a lot of skill to eventually arrive in this position. So this is why schools like Top Gun emerged, the Air Force Fighter Weapons School as well, to make sure pilots knew how to do this very well. We also end up developing platforms like the F-22 that are very maneuverable. The more maneuverable your platform, the better off you're going to be in a dogfight, right? So thrust vectoring on a Raptor now makes it, takes an aircraft that really no matter where you are, let's say I'm back here behind a Raptor, with thrust vectoring, he can snap his nose and point at me and shoot me. So it's actually quite impressive to see. My point is, we spent a lot of money investing in this very high-end technology to build the most maneuverable fighter in the world, and the Raptor is absolutely that. It's impressive. Well, our adversaries can't compete on this level. Now, they built some very formidable fighters, very maneuverable, the Su-27, Su-30. Those are all very capable platforms, but not on par with the Raptor. So what they did instead is they invested in comparatively low-end missile technology, very maneuverable missiles. They coupled them with helmet-mounted cueing systems. They're heat-seeking type missiles. And now these missiles make it such that they don't have to point at an aircraft to kill it. They can simply cue the missile and let the missile do the turning. So now suddenly in this environment, the maneuverability of a Raptor becomes irrelevant. It's completely disrupted as high-offset missiles now become the name of the game. And that's certainly where we are now. We've obviously reinvested. We've had the capital, fortunately, to be able to do that. But we were at a disadvantage for some years because of that disruption.
Now, when you think about this, and Cliff used this term hedge, so seeing these high-end investments as hedges, okay? And Derek's described it as a situation in which all of those investments become not perhaps irrelevant would be an overstatement, but less relevant, right? You know, so Cliff, you want to talk a little bit more about that idea of hedging? What did you mean by that?
So when we look at, again, going back to definitions, when we look at reducing risk, there's basically two elements of risk: probability and consequence. And when we were working on this, what we found is we're good in the consequence department. What Derek's up here eloquently describing, and probably notably why the Air Force doesn't really suffer as many budget cuts as the Army does, because they get to do the airplanes with their hands.
There it is.
As we look at this, we look at consequence, and we hedge against that consequence. And what we've kind of termed as an exquisite hedge are these platforms that are technologically advanced, that are able to work against that high-end threat. And that's intended to lower the consequence, thus lowering risk. And it's really when you're talking to, and for the senior leaders of the military to try to convey this to members of Congress or the American public, it's a little bit difficult to say, well, I'm trying to lower consequence, so I'm going to buy more F-35s. And so as we were working through this, we were trying to figure out a way that would articulate this a little bit cleaner and be able to put it in civilian terms. And so the analogy that we came up with is really looking at a homeowner's insurance policy. So if I'm trying to buy coverage for tornado coverage, or a policy for tornado damage, I can only lower the consequence of a tornado. I can't really do anything short of moving in a place that doesn't have tornadoes. I can only really manage the consequence. So I go out and I buy a policy, and that serves as our hedge that reduces the consequence of a tornado. Now take a more complex policy like a fire insurance. Here we see more of an interaction where the homeowner can not only lower the consequence by having a fire insurance policy, but also lower the probability through preventive measures like inspections on their heating systems, electrical systems, and practice of fire safety or fire prevention. So that would lower the probability of a fire. When we marry this hedge with these preventive measures that we call pledges, so you marry these, this gives you a balanced approach to reducing risk. And I'll use a real quick example of this in military terms, and Chuck brought this up. If you think of it through the terms of the IED situation that we were facing in Iraq and Afghanistan, the hedge is represented by those material solutions that we had, the MRAPs, the protective gear. It lowered the consequence of the IED explosion. In other words, we had less casualties based on that. And we focused on those material solutions, right? We moved mountains to get MRAPs purchased and get them into theater. But we didn't see a significant reduction in risk because we didn't look at lowering the probability of an IED strike in that pledge. And so as we lowered the consequence, we realized that the probability is still there. We started to look at measures that would reduce the probability of a strike. And that's where you see some of the electronic countermeasures, route surveillance, the intelligence gathering on the IED network. And it wasn't until, and this is what the military was referring to, left of the blast, trying to get left of the blast to prevent or lower the probability of an IED being effective or being employed. And so when you couple those, when you bring together this hedge in the material solution and the pledge of being able to reduce probability, that's where you really truly reduce risk. And I'm going to assert here that I don't know that we do so well. We're very good at the hedges. We like our hedges. I don't know how well we are able to reduce the probability of these risks. And that's really where we need to start looking at our strategic guidance of the force on how we can do that better.
Yeah, and I think one of the additional challenges in the security environment is that, imagine a tornado that increased its severity when it saw that the homeowner had insurance, right? Which is sort of what happens in war, is that when your adversary sees that you're operating more heavily armored vehicles, they change, Chuck, you were talking the other day about this, they change the potency of the explosives that they're using. I think this is a good segue, Chuck, for you to talk about, that more holistic view of risk, because Cliff has described how, this focus on the hedge side is necessarily incomplete.
Yeah, so, when look back at the doctrinal definition of risk, and, at least from, my small perch that, may be kind of insufficient when we look at strategic risk, looked at a number of different writers who've written on this notion of risk, and one of them that was particularly useful was a professor, Würzberger, who currently teaches in Israel, but looked at it from the view of foreign military interventions, and what he advocates is this view that, as both my colleagues have talked about, but there's this idea of consequence. So, you've got a consequence. And the way I tried to define it was an adverse consequence that arises from internal or external conditions of the strategic environment that misaligns ends, ways, and or means. So you could have varying combinations of ends, ways, and means being misaligned to create risk. But I added kind of one element above and beyond that, and it was this idea of linking the consequence to the intensity of the interest. And so, here we talk about, these four levels of interest. You have, your existential or survival, you have vital, important, and peripheral. And so using that as a way to develop maybe a way to scale or prioritize how you view those risks, and then obviously, the more important interest that was being viewed as risky, or risk to the more important interest, then, you would prioritize your resources and your strategies to deal with those based on how you looked at the intensity of the interest. And so I think when we talk strategy, I think that's a more useful way to look at it, that you have this idea that a risk isn't necessarily a threat. It's not uncertainty. It's not a hazard. Those in and of themselves aren't risks. Risk, at least in the definition I use, is created when there's a consequence that misaligns our strategy. So if you have a strategy that is resilient enough to survive, a number of shocks to it, do those things necessarily equate to risk? My view of it is no. And so when you look at this idea that a risk is created when your strategy becomes misaligned or imbalanced, then maybe that kind of changes the discussion that we can have about how we look at risk mitigation strategies. In the strategic environment, we kind of move away from this idea that anything that creates the potential for loss equals a risk, and therefore we must do something about it. I just don't know that view is sustainable in the long term when the varied problem sets that as a Defense Department we're trying to deal with. You got counterterrorism. You have the PACOM commander who talks about climate change as being a risk. So you have this broad spectrum of things that we're viewing as risks, but if one were to actually sit down and cost and resource our strategy to answer each one of these things that our combatant commanders, the chairman, the service chiefs are talking about as risks, I think if we were to actually sit down and try to put a dollar figure on that, I don't know that is a level of resourcing that would be even feasible. Even if we tried to do that by coalitions, which would be a way to hedge the consequence, or burden sharing that you hear about folks talking about with NATO, et cetera. So I think, kind of to wrap it up, the holistic view of looking at consequence, the interest that the strategy is trying to satisfy, and how those misalign ends, ways, and means, I think may provide us a different way to look at strategic risk and how maybe we design better strategies to mitigate those aspects of it.
Is prioritization more difficult today than it was 30 years ago? I mean, people suggest that, but do you think that that's true? Or
I don't know. I think when Admiral Winnfield came up here, I think he articulated pretty clearly what, there were 6 strategic objectives or interests that he and the chairman looked at, and obviously risks that met more of those objectives or strategies that met more of those objectives received a relative priority versus others. So I think we have the ability to prioritize it. I think I think the challenge that we have is understanding what risk we're assuming that we're not aware of. I think those are some of the challenge. I think that's where we're seeing our challenge. I think strategic priorities, I think the chairman has made it abundantly clear what those are. I just don't know that underlying that there's probably a level of risk that we're assuming in areas that we're simply not focused on. That.
Can you give me an example of where you see some of those hidden risks? Or
Well, I think if you look at Homeland Security, for example, if you look at the resources that say Southcom gets devoted and dealing with the migration of criminal networks and the drug trade and the drug trafficking, I mean, those are real threats that manifest inside our borders every single day. But we don't apply a lot of resources to those because we've tried to prioritize our terrorist threats and their ability to attack within the United States. I mean, defending the homeland, whether that's strategic nuclear deterrence and our CT strategy. I mean, I think that's been the top line strategic priority for the chairman, which I think we would all agree makes sense. But we have risks that emanate out of Southcom and part of the Northcom AOR every single day within our borders, and yet there's really not anything that we're doing about it in a meaningful way relative to how we're attacking these other threats that they're there. But we don't see terrorism in our soil every day, but we see the effects of the drug trade and all these other threats that come from different AORs inside our borders every single day, and it's local, it's state, and it's at the national level. So I think how that plays out within our society, I don't know. I mean, I'm not going to advocate how that plays out, but I think there's areas where that risk is being assumed because it's not an immediate catastrophic effect like a terrorist attack would be, say, in Times Square or someplace like that.
Cliff, did you want to?
You hear a lot of the argument of our inability to prioritize national security threats and what our objectives are and align our ends and ways and means. And there's obviously some truth to that and a reality there that we face. But there's something that's the undercurrent here that may be a little bit more dangerous to us, and that is, look, the way that we articulate these requirements is through risk. We allocate resources through risk. And that's not a bad thing, but we have to understand that when the combatant commander goes to Congress and starts talking about the threats in their area of responsibility, they're doing that in order to justify, to argue for, to fight for resources. So risk articulation has actually become the coin of the realm for the commanders, for the services, and for the chairman. By being able to articulate this risk, they're able to fight for these resources. Let's look at a couple examples of this. When the Ford-class aircraft carrier came under attack, what you saw especially in D.C., is pictures of China's one and only aircraft carrier that they purchased from Russia. Why is that important? Well, because we were articulating to you, and the defense lobby was articulating to you, a risk that is associated with not having the Ford-class carrier or 10 active carrier groups afloat. So we've actually decided to now articulate our needs through risk. Well, if you're the Southcom commander, how do you compete with CENTCOM? If you're the EUCOM commander, how do you compete with AFRICOM or the PACOM commander? Well, you've got to be able to articulate this risk in a way that resonates with the decision makers in order to preserve your resources. And we open up some opportunity here for risk exaggeration, risk inflation. We get to hear about the threat from North Korean ballistic missiles, And so what you have from the PACOM commander is, well, we need Arleigh Burke cruisers standing off the shore of Korea 24/7, and we need 5 of them. Now, it becomes a little bit of a used car deal here, because what happens is he may need 4, he's asking for 6, realizing he'll get 5. But the problem is that our resources are finite, so where are those coming from? And these are the things that we're struggling with now. So it's really hard to prioritize in that type of environment. It's hard to go and say, ISIS is the priority of our national security strategy and thus the resource for the Department of Defense, and still be able to allocate resources to PACOM, to EUCOM. And so what this creates is an environment where we become crisis du jour. If you're the EUCOM commander, you want to talk about the crisis in Ukraine. If you're the AFRICOM commander, you want to talk about the expansion of the Islamic State in the Sahel and the Maghreb. If you're the PACOM commander, you want to talk about a rising China. You want to talk about A2AD. So we just have to be mindful that this is the environment in which we live in. And it really is to the point, and I think what Andrew's teasing out is, it's really hard to prioritize when you're in that, because if you're not the priority, it's not that we're not going to give you any resources, it's just you're going to have to fight for them differently. And that's the way it is right now for us.
The insurance example is really interesting, because that's a business that relies on good data, empirical data. So they construct these probability distributions and say, okay, the likelihood of this outcome is X, the loss, well, the customer kind of determines what the loss is based on what car he drives, what kind of house she owns, annual earnings if you're in the life insurance market. Chuck, you pointed out earlier that a huge problem in the strategic environment is that, I mean, we don't really have an empirical distribution for the consequences of ISIS. You know, I mean, it's sort of, you know, what happens if we don't do anything about that, right? What does that mean in sort of practical terms? So, I mean, that's challenging, and it does suggest that pure focus on consequence mitigation is insufficient, that we need to think more about altering the shape of events, reducing the probability of those events, introducing stability. I want to shift gears a little bit now and talk about a couple of other areas where you do hear risk discussed in defense strategy. First one, I want to come back to this idea of the latent power of the United States. For the United States, for much of its history, its primary means of preparing for conflict was not to prepare, really, in the sense of looking at geography and saying, okay, well, here we are, we're isolated by these 2 great oceans. The great powers are distant, and if something bad happens over there, wherever that is, we will have time. And the term, the arsenal of democracy, the massive industrial capability of the United States to mobilize and develop that force, turn latent force into actual force, was a big part of America's strategy in both world wars. Derek, I'm curious, when you look at competition, when you look at the defense industrial base today, do you think that still applies? I mean, is that still a useful way to think about risk reduction? And I mean, or has the environment changed? I mean, do we not have the time afforded by our splendid isolation? Do we still have the industrial capability to sort of say, hey, that latent force is out there?
I'll focus more on the competition portion of your question, but I think the more we rely on exquisite hedges, as Cliff said, or high-end platforms, the less you can do that. I mean, clearly the F-35 has been in development for about 15 to 20 years. I mean, the lead times just don't afford that. You can't just stop and then pick that up when you finally determine you have to have air superiority in a country. But let me talk more to competition and how that plays out. There was a recent study by RAND that looked closely at cases where maybe in large defense acquisition where it wasn't actually productive to have competition. Okay, that kind of sounds un-American, so I'll qualify it just a little bit. Basically, they looked at kind of two scenarios, the ideal market and then what the large defense acquisition market looks like. So in an ideal market, you'd have lots of consumers, lots of producers. You'd have relative equality among producers in technology in terms of means of production. Your transactions would be simple, kind of one-step transactions. Whereas in a large defense acquisition market, obviously the investment, the capital, means of production are very expensive, so they're not going to be equally held across producers. Transactions are going to be large, multi-step processes with lots of renegotiation. So what you're buying now actually and what you buy later, those are very much related. It's not just kind of a one-time transaction. So because of all these factors and many others, they determined that in these cases, when they're such as like an F-35 or aircraft carriers, it actually is beneficial for the government not to compete and to go with a sole producer. Okay, so we could stop right there and go, okay, good, we feel good. RAND has told us we don't need to compete. Competition no longer required. I don't think that's the case. I think there are some opportunities where you absolutely can and should introduce competition into the system. So let's look at an aircraft carrier. I'll pick on another service for a little while because it's a little easier. As you look at an aircraft carrier, Huntington Ingalls pretty much owns the entire production function, from producing the aircraft carrier to refueling it to overhauling it, all that stuff. And if you broke down the production function itself, you'd see that Huntington Ingalls pretty much controls all of those aspects as well. So when I'm talking about the production function, raw materials, the means of production themselves, so the big shipyards that are very expensive to operate, technology, labor, facilities, all those things, Huntington Ingalls owns them. Well, there's some problems with that, because when they own all the components of the production function, there's no need or really an incentive for them to introduce competition. They'd be competing against themselves. So all the wonderful benefits that we could reap from competition are kind of squelched, because for Huntington Ingalls, the status quo, where they're at, is very profitable. So why would they introduce anything else? So let's just flip that around, and let's say you take several pieces of that production function. I won't get into which ones, but let's just say you take, well, I'll give you an example. Let's say you take labor, and you go, we're going to compete that. Now Huntington Ingalls doesn't have the corner of the market on it. You now have a new company that has an incentive to innovate, that has an incentive to cut costs, and now you're once again reaping the benefits of competition, albeit in a smaller component of that production function, still an important one. That concept you could introduce in a number of different aspects across the production function of an F-35 or an aircraft carrier. It's just not the way we do business. We tend to just rely on one contractor, and they're very powerful lobbies, and it kind of stops there. I think there are better ways to do it that could save money and ultimately decrease risk.
Yeah, I mean, and in fact, if you think about it that way, you can also mitigate the sole producer risk, because, I mean, the counter argument, I know General Dynamics made this argument regarding M1 production, and that was that if the Army doesn't buy more of these tanks right now, we will have to shut down production, and we don't know how well we can reboot that, because this isn't like converting a truck line to producing Sherman tanks. These things are built in batch processing, in place. It's actually more like building, to go back to your example, the Ferrari. I mean, this is highly skilled craftsmen building a very high capability platform. So the firm is sort of telling the government, look, if you want to be able to call on this production capability, we must maintain some minimal rate of production. I mean, does what you're describing, how does what you're describing help kind of mitigate that risk?
Yeah, no, you're right. I didn't quite get into that. As it is right now, Huntington Ingalls in many ways, dictating may be a strong word, but they're certainly strongly influencing the number of carriers we buy, for example. Because if we say we're going to slow down or purchase less, obviously restarting that defense industrial base would be very expensive. They could slow production on our current carriers to keep the production line open. So you end up in a situation where the government almost can't afford not to continue to buy more aircraft carriers. So you have a producer that is basically influencing acquisition decisions that should, in my opinion, be based on what's best for national defense. And that's where I think the risk is introduced.
And then the counter argument is, well, we have to have the production capacity. That's important for national defense. And you end up with this sort of cycle of not optimal decision making. Now, related to that, and Chuck, I was wondering if you could comment on this, is this idea of reversibility and expandability. So kind of coming to the force structure discussion. And I think time, again, comes into this, right? It comes into the industrial base, but it also comes into okay, we're going to give up this capability because we don't think we're going to need it, but if we do need it, we'll buy it back from the market. That's the idea of reversibility. Expandability is, okay, we're going to shrink the capability or capacity, and if it's required, we will grow it. You can grow it through maybe actually growing organically the active component, or maybe adding it with the reserve. Your thoughts on that, and I mean, how well articulated in your view is that structure? Is that something that we need to explore more? How can we do that well?
Well, we certainly see that discussion when as we're in the Army is looking to downsize, and do we divest capability? Do we transfer capability into the reserve component that could then be trained, albeit at a less capable rate, but then when needed to mobilize, we can mobilize that capability and be able to employ it as needed. And I think there are certain capabilities where that may make sense, but if you, back to the level of strategy, we're really predicated upon power projection as a nation, to be able to project force globally within a short amount of time to achieve some strategic objective. If you look at the regional threats, I think that we would look at facing, whether it be China and their ability to influence South China Sea, East China Sea, or you look at Russia most recently in the Ukraine, the expandability component to what you talked about with risk mitigation, I think starts to no longer apply, because the time at which we saw Russia destabilize and take the Crimea, take parts of the Ukraine, by the time we could mobilize force that may have been sufficient to either stabilize the situation or even arrest Russian gains, our ability to project force that quickly into those areas, I think, is limited. And so if we're going to rely upon the ability to mobilize in these regional threats, I think that's where we're going to have a hard time. So how do you then look at mitigation strategies? Do you forward deploy more forces again, like we had in Europe, where we've now gone to a rotational strategy of armored brigades in Europe to mitigate the effects of deactivating the 170th and the 172nd, for example. So now, rather than a permanently based armored formation in Europe to be a deterrent effect, we're now relying on a rotational base, which creates, in some ways, its own problems and challenges. There's flexibility that it affords, but it also comes at some consequence. So I think that the speed at which warfare can occur now, and particularly by capable regional threats, how fast that can occur, I think, limits our ability to use, this idea of being able to expand quickly and employ. So there's probably a sweet spot at which we can get to a level of force structure where we can rapidly employ sufficient force to achieve a strategic objective, but then how that balances against the time at which these more capable regional threats are emerging and are able to influence the situation, time may work against us in our ability to do that. So I think we have to be careful about how fast would we need to expand and how much time to train and man and equip. And that's where I think the high and low end makes sense. When we look at the platforms that those forces would be equipped with. If we're going to equip these forces to expand with high-end capable systems, that may work against us, where if we're needing to rapidly expand the Army, for example, expanding with lower-end capabilities may be able to employ those brigades, train them, and be able to employ them quicker versus more high-end capabilities that take more time for those soldiers to become familiar with the equipment and to be able to use. So I think that our ability to do that is rapidly becoming more difficult, I think, to quickly expand if we're going to rely on these exquisite capabilities that we've come to develop and become accustomed to employing.
One more question, then we'll open it up for questions from the audience for Cliff. In some recent strategic documents, there has been an explicit statement that the United States really needs to avoid prolonged ground commitments. Okay, that seems like a kind of explicit acknowledgement of risk. is it? I mean, how do you see that from a risk management standpoint? I mean, is that what you have in mind in terms of pledges?
I don't. I think it's the never again adage of what we've seen in the phase 4, phase 5 operations. And so I don't know that is actually an explicit acceptance of risk. I think because it's not reducing the amount of engagements or operations that we're conducting. It's attempting to reduce the duration. And that's because we'll have less capacity. We have less people to do less in all the places where we're trying to do that. I don't think that that's the reality, and I think what those phrases try to capture is this idea of nation building and starting from scratch in countries. We're not going to do that again. That's the never again. And so I don't view that as reducing risk. I do see it, though, fitting into more of the political will of reducing what we're saying our operations are going to be. Because at the same time, when we say we're not going to be doing prolonged operations, we're also putting a premium on building partnership capability. And if you look at the two hallmarks of building partnership capability, for me, that are most relevant is what we see in Korea and what we've been able to work with the ROC Army. And a more timely example is the Egyptian security forces and the amounts of time that we've invested into those forces to build that partnership capability. So while those phrases that Andrew mentioned are applied to going in and building a nation in phase 5 and kind of finishing up the conflict and how wars end, I still think we're going to have long duration operations that are in more places than what we're doing right now.
Yeah, it sort of reminds me of a baseball coach who tells his batters because they cannot hit curveballs, they're not going to swing at curveballs. But you don't get to choose which pitches the opposition throws, right? And if we disavow something because we have struggled with it,
yes.
It's almost like we're laying out the optimal strategy for the opposition.
Well, and it also ties to what I was mentioning earlier of, since 9/11, people are listening to the conversations about risk. We have an informed public, and they know what the military is building and what they need. And when we talk about these phase, these long-term nation building, let's call them, the concern there is as the Army decision makers are looking at force structure and what they can keep and what the perception of the American public and the United States Congress is going to be, is that the reality that we are moving a lot of the force structure that would be required for those types of operations into the reserve component to keep the contingency operation forces in those numbers. So we're padding the numbers a little bit when we do that. And again, it goes back to how we articulate risk as military leaders and what we're trying to convey to members of Congress and the American public.
Thanks. Do we have any questions from the audience? Sir?
Yeah, my name is Russell King. I was formerly on an aircraft carrier, so I've been dominated by Huntington Ingalls. It's easier for me to pick on the Air Force. I'm going to give a question to Colonel O'Malley. I went to Air War College non-resident in 2007, and my paper was on the tanker deal between Boeing and Northrop Grumman. And I can see there are a lot of risks involved in this. For one thing, there aren't that many manufacturers of wide-bodied aircraft. So what you said about Huntington Ingalls, there's a corresponding situation with the Air Force. They've had a close working relationship with Boeing for many years, and so the Boeing's somewhat of a near monopoly, I think, in the Air Force. But I don't think that's totally bad because these are very complex things, wide-body aircraft and aircraft carriers. So while competition's good, I think a certain amount of monopoly is not totally bad necessarily. But I'd like to discuss risks in association with the tanker deal. I know there was Air Force pilots who are flying planes a lot older than they are, and so there's a safety risk for them. There's also obviously the operational risk because the tankers are necessary for long-range air operations. Also the political risk. Some people were saying, well, because Northrop Grumman was using Airbus planes, that's a foreign country that we're using as our source. There might be some lack of dependability there. And of course, the counter to that is, Boeing's not really American, it's also an international company. Also, there's a political risk. If somebody in Congress gives you exactly what you want on a very big, important deal like this, you mess it up, then that congressman is then responsible for a boondoggle. So please discuss risk in association with.
Yeah, well, frankly, I think you just discussed it probably better than I'm going to. I'm not intimately familiar with the tanker deal. I'll speak briefly from a tactical perspective as well of why you need to replace the things. They are very old. I can think of many times where you pull up under the tanker to refuel, and you rely on director lights to be able to see where you are, and those things don't really work anymore. So you just kind of zen your way underneath the tanker. So no doubt they're getting old. It's something we need to replace. It's a capability the Air Force relies on very heavily. I used Huntington and Ingalls, and frankly, I should have picked one that I'm more familiar with. I used it simply as an analogy or an example of what's happening in a variety of places, as you said, and I agree with you. It certainly is happening in the Air Force in many places. I also agree with you, and Rand agrees with you, that there are certain, in big defense contracts like this, it doesn't necessarily make sense to have multiple competitors building these airplanes. There was a push in the F-35 program to have another engine. You have a GE motor, as we've done in the F-16. You have General Electric and Pratt & Whitney building engines to try and reap the benefits of competition in that sense. So I guess from that model, I would say, I think there ought to be components, perhaps in the tanker, whether it's avionics within the tanker. And I got to be clear, I really don't know much about the program, so I'm trying to be broad here. But I think that components of that could be competed exactly as I said with the aircraft carrier, whether it's labor production, whether it's overhaul. I mean, fortunately, in the case of a tanker, that technology is not something that only one company, wide-body airplanes are fairly widely proliferated. A lot of companies know how to work on them and build them. So I think you could potentially introduce more competition there, but not in the production. Let me stop there, and maybe you want to focus me more. I don't want to just dance around and hope I hit something. Do you want me to talk about?
That's fine, whatever you're comfortable with.
Yeah, I guess I'll stop there because if we were talking about F-35s, I'd have a lot more expert insight, but frankly, I think you know more than I do on that one, sir. So thank you.
So there's a question from a distant station, and Cliff, maybe you can take this first, and Chuck, if you want to follow it. How can risk be addressed via integration of diplomacy, defense, and development?
That's actually a great question, because when we look at the hedges and pledges, as we said, in reducing risk in a balanced approach, certainly balancing the application of the instruments of power is a huge part of that. And frankly, we have moved towards a bias towards the military instrument of power. Look, we have a strategic impatience. We want things to happen now. It's a little bit of what Andrew was talking about a little bit earlier, alluding to on managing risk through time and being able to reduce volatility by stretching it out over time. Unfortunately, I don't know that we have the strategic patience to do that. An element of being able to use time and leave more flexible options on the table is using the other elements of power on diplomatic, informational, and economic. We see this with sanctions. We see this with diplomatic efforts supported by the threat of military force. The problem is I think we can all cite some examples to where we don't allow the time to actually allow a lot of these things to take hold. And it's hard to negotiate that way. So moving forward as we reduce risk, and we've mainly focused on the military side of this and how we need to manage risk through the military instrument. But a huge part of that at the strategic level is being able to balance the elements of power, and that will afford the opportunity for us to reduce risk through the use of time.
Yeah, and I think time is certainly one of the key maybe measures that we want to take a look at. I think there's this notion that there's this immediacy that we need to satisfy strategic situations that have underlying structural problems that have been decades or centuries in the making. If you look at the Sunni-Shia divide in the Middle East right now, and you see Islamic State on one side, and you see Iran and the Shia on the other side, and they talk about this arc of Shia instability from Damascus to Tehran. How do you have this? How do you not have to demonstrate some degree of strategic patience to deal with a situation that's been in the making since the late 600s? And to think that there's a quick turn strategy that is going to solve some of those structural problems in a way that help us reduce risks in the strategic environment. So I think time is certainly one notion, but I think there needs to be a real discussion. And I know Secretary Gates, when he was the defense secretary, talked a lot about it, is the resources that we give other areas of the government to do the things that we need them to do. And I think that's one area where, from a risk perspective, when you look at the whole of government, are we imbalanced or not in terms of the resources that we give the rest of the government that have a constituency to help solve some of these strategic problems, like the State Department, USAID, and some of the others. There has to be a real conversation at some point about the level of resourcing that we give other areas of the government to take some of the load off the military in terms of what we are trying to do. We found ourselves in a lot of unnatural positions doing development and things that we're just simply not suited or trained to do, but because the resources and capacity aren't there in some of the areas of government that is their core function, we've really gotten out of balance in terms of those capabilities. And so I think time is one, but then we got to look at the resource mix of what we give state and others relative to what the resourcing that the Defense Department gets.
Sir?
Yeah, this question is for Lieutenant Colonel O'Malley, and in no way am I just trying to pile on the Air Force here. But you had spoken about the F-35 and their high-end and low-end solution sets, and I'm sure it does the high-end extremely well. But it's my understanding that it still is eventually going to replace the A-10 in close air support. And I think it's generally known that it probably doesn't do that as well as the A-10. And personally, I love the A-10. Yeah. But to use your analogy, if the F-35 is a Ferrari, what is needed is a Toyota pickup truck with a 50 cal mounted on the back. Yeah. So in terms of risk, what is the Air Force just assuming that risk that it's not going to do the close air support as well, or are there other mitigating solutions or anything that the Air Force is planning on or in a strategy?
No, I'm happy to answer that. I'm actually glad you asked that. I had thought about going there myself in the discussion, so I'll be happy to talk about it. First of all, if you ask any, General Welsh, who was here, just our Chief of Staff here last week, the Air Force does not want to retire the A-10. I think that you hear that a lot on blogs, that we don't like CAS, we want to get rid of the A-10. I say that's not true. The Air Force would say, though, we're in the business of saving lives, and we want to do that. We want to provide the best possible support, save as many people on the ground as we possibly can. And the Air Force would certainly argue that the way you do that is by being effective in the high-end mission, certainly. If you fail in air superiority, that's obviously a problem. You never even get to CAS, so I won't get into too much detail. You can understand that. So to go directly to your question, are we accepting some risk by divesting the A-10? If you look at the number of sorties right now that we fly in terms of CAS, I think it's about 70% are flown by other platforms. So we do have plenty of other very capable CAS platforms. But I would never say to an Army audience, having done CAS and the F-16 in combat, that those guys on the ground were as happy to see me as they were to see the A-10s. I know that's not true. But I want to make it clear that there are very good, capable CAS platforms in our inventory. We do the job fairly well. We don't have 30 millimeter cannons. We have 20 millimeter, and that's a big difference to the guys on the ground. I get that. Will the F-35 be an effective CAS platform? I think if you think of the F-35, if you use an F-35 the way you've used an A-10, if that's your vision of CAS, then no. It's a horrible, it's not going to do well. I've done CAS in the F-35, not in combat, obviously, but I've flown the tests on it, and it is as capable, it's very F-16-like. I can drop precision weapons very well, very efficiently, have a lot of situational awareness. So if that's the kind of tactical scenario you're doing CAS in, you can do it well. When you get into strafe, it has a 25 millimeter, so a little better than an F-16. But right now, with the helmet-mounted cueing system, I don't have the ability to aim those bullets very accurately. So it is a step backwards right now in that regard. However, this is where I think the Air Force could do better in articulating what the F-35 can and ought to be doing. And that is, how are we going to do CAS in the future? Not the way we've done CAS for the past 20 to 30 years, but how are we going to do it tomorrow and on into the future? An F-35, in my view, would be much more effective used kind of a FAC-A type platform where you have tremendous SA in that cockpit. I mean, I've got two big iPad-like screens that are touch screen that you have a lot of situational awareness that you've never had in a cockpit before. With that situational awareness, you could do a lot to direct the fight, to do CAS very well. And Dr. Hill and I are actually writing a paper on this. The way I would use the F-35 is as an exquisite platform. Don't buy as many of them, but use that as an air battle management type platform, controlling a series of other potentially unmanned platforms that will have a lot more persistence, perhaps could be launched by the ground forces themselves. So even an A-10, with the great loader times it has compared to an F-16, we could do a lot better. We could bring a lot more precision than we're doing right now. So my hope is that rather than thinking of doing CAS the way we've done it, that we'll actually look at a true transformation. If we do that, the F-35 can do well for you. But as a simple A-10 replacement, I wouldn't do it. You bet, sir.
Sir.
I'm Major General Dennis Lake, United States Army, retired. And I have one comment and then one question. Early on, you talked about the budget in the context of relative to GDP. The other way to look at it is that the U.S. defense budget is larger than the next 10 to 14 countries in the world combined. We're $19 trillion in debt, and the Defense Department since 1996 has avoided a congressional mandate to have their books audited, and that was reviewed or renewed in 2009. So there's another context to look at this that's more broad and is seen in a different way in the civilian society. But my question is, when we talk about risk, given what we've learned the last 14 years of war in Iraq and Afghanistan with an all-volunteer force, we changed a number of things and had a number of consequences. We changed the deployment policy from 1 to 3 to almost 1 to 1. We used stop-loss. We had unprecedented enlistment bonuses. We used psychotropic drugs. We used contractors in an unprecedented way, and we used the Reserve and National Guard as they were never intended to be used going back to the Gates Commission in 1973. Given all of those things, my question to you is, in your judgment, when we look at risk, is the all-volunteer force working, and will it work in the future based on fairness, efficiency, and sustainability?
I'll field that because I did a lot of work with General Dempsey on the all-volunteer force. The 40th anniversary of the all-volunteer force was last year, and a lot of questions come up about the sustainability and our ability to maintain those force levels. So I really appreciate your comments. As we look at the sustainability, and what we have to keep an eye on, and really foundational to our work, and what we probably should have said on the onset, is everything that we're looking at is building the joint force that the nation needs. And I think all of us in this room can point out at different aspects of defense management, budget resourcing for the Department of Defense, where we may not be doing such a good job, or we may not be building the force that the nation needs. And it's a tall order to do that. It's taking the context of the threats and the environment that we face today and building a force for tomorrow and trying to counter these threats. A lot of what Derek will discuss on the F-35, what he was working on, aren't threats that we're necessarily facing today, but the developmental process for the threats that we're going to face tomorrow. My point, sir, is it's a hard thing to be able to predict what the joint force of that future needs to be. And I think that that's why Secretary Work, certainly Secretary Hagel when he was in office, and now Secretary Carter, the reason they're looking at this as a third offset, and they really go back to Secretary Brown's offset in 1975, 1976, is look at the advancements and the investments that the military made during the 70s. They're the technology that we rely on today. Stealth technology, precision-guided munitions, global communications through satellites and navigation systems. All of these were the technologies that were invested in the 70s. What we don't like to talk about is that was funded through trade-offs, through a reduction of ground forces. So we had to pay for those things, and they developed. Those were transformational strategies that really sets us apart today and gives us our technology edge. As we're moving forward, are we going to be able to predict that? Are we going to be able to find the force structure for the Army that they need? What is the right number? I certainly think, to answer your question directly on the all-volunteer force, I think that as we reduce, and look, there's a lot of conversations out there when we talk about institutional reform, which includes pay and compensation reform. There's a lot of hazards out there that we face that can threaten the all-volunteer force. But it's all about getting to those right numbers. And for me personally, sitting here, and what I've heard General Dempsey say is that we can field the all-volunteer force and that professional Army as we move forward. But it really is going to take some strong leadership. It's going to be allowing the military to make these hard decisions that we need to make. That includes institutional reform to be able to maintain that in a sustainable and effective way.
If I could add maybe one perspective to that, sir, would be, if you look at the force generation cycle, and we're now with regional alignment of forces, and we're going to a rotational strategy instead of a forward-based strategy. 9 months away from home is still 9 months away from home. I don't care if it's Poland, the Czech Republic, the Baltics, or if it's deployed to Iraq, Afghanistan, or any other number of places that we could find ourselves in. I think my view from watching some of my subordinates who have many more combat tours than I do, I've had majors that are on their 5th or 6th tour. Some, obviously most of that is Iraq and Afghanistan, but now we're moving to these, rotations into the PACOM AOR with Pacific Pathways. We're rotating into Europe now. We've got forces that are going in and out of Africa now. If we're not mindful of the effect that can have on the attrition of not first-term enlistees or first-term officers, but the ability to keep those enlisted soldiers who are going to become senior sergeants, those junior officers who are going to become our field grade officers someday, that may be where we see the wheels come off the cart. If our rotational posture maintains the same pace as it has the last 14 years, at some point, just being human is going to be being human. And I don't know that it is necessarily sustainable to rely on a rotational posture where it's not as lethal as Iraq and Afghanistan, but it still certainly creates the same level of friction on our families and how that maybe contributes to our all-volunteer force. So maybe a different perspective, at least I think from the Army side of the house. Thank you.
Okay.
Just one quick question.
One follow-up.
Yeah.
Thank you for the discussion so far. This morning we discussed basically the material point of things. And if this is outside of the scope, let me know. But there's a cyber piece that's come along here that's here basically. And in terms of risk management and what we're trying to do from the DoD standpoint. Typically when we're talking about strategy, you haven't mentioned variable as time, which I'm glad you guys mentioned. But when you're looking at cyber, time, we're talking milliseconds and nanoseconds and sometimes in terms of responding to threats and potential harm, right? So my thing is, will strategy and risk management have to change I guess in conjunction with this new cyber threat?
Yeah, I think cyber obviously is expanding, and the department is expanding into the cyber world with Each of the service components now have a cyber, a 3-star level command associated with each of them. There's a couple of different things that we struggle with, I think, and when we talk about cyber is, first, who owns it within the whole of government approach? And I think we have to wrestle through that. Whether it's a military, whether the military owns it, whether the FBI owns it, Department of Justice, Homeland Security are all players in that. Right now, though, taking it to the Department of Defense, cyber is one of these offsets that the department's looking at, much like stealth technology, precision-guided munitions were in the 70s. And so I think that when you're here to hear Secretary Work talk, he will mention cyber as an offset so that we may be reducing some of the force requirements or, whether it's strike capability through cyber. And once you assign that name, as an offset that we're going to use cyber to offset maybe long range strike or whatever that may be, I think it will get a lot more attention and a lot more resource added to it.
And there's a public-private component to this as well. One of the insights out of the New York City trip last month that we took was the willingness or unwillingness of private corporations to partner and work with government to counter cyber. So while we certainly own the defense of our own infrastructure, who owns the defense of the infrastructure for Wall Street, for Sony, for all these other companies that rely on the internet for some means of revenue? So I think it's a bigger problem than just looking at it from DoD. I mean, who owns the defense of the national infrastructure for cyber? Well, a lot of people do. And so how we term strategy and policy in terms of the public-private mix of how cyber defense and the ability to warn a company, hey, we know this threat's coming because we can see it, but there's sort of a tension between partnering with government because, let's be frank, some of the policies that we've developed through NSA has caused private industry to be a little fearful of too close a partnership with the government. So I think, part of that has got to be, we got to get the policy right in terms of a legal framework and in terms of how we partner with industry, because the infrastructure for cyber is not just government. It's not just owned by the government. It's sort of a public common as well, and how we play a role in that is, the policy and the strategy that comes along with that to address that.